Hey, well, thanks for coming, everybody. My name is Joseph Smolinski. I'm a new board member of the Block Island Arts Council, and I also coordinate a program called Low Season Artist Projects, which helps bring artists out to the island to stay and make work and think and contemplate and write and come here and talk to people. So, this is a new version of what we're working on, thanks to Magdalene Livesey, who's been really generous about letting us use her property to host artists and academics and writers. We're going to be doing some more programming during the winter, and so this is the first start of that. So I'm really excited to announce both Jeff and Rene, who are good long-term friends and fellow New Havenites, and just a wonderful, couple to come out and trial this new winter residency for us. So Jeff Ostergren is an artist from New Haven, really works in painting, sculpture, video, drawing, installation. Lately he's been working in these really saturated, visually pointillist kind of works that incorporate pharmaceuticals and paint in different ways, and connecting to the history of pharmaceuticals and color in different ways that those industries connect. Jeff has had some amazing solo exhibitions, most recently at Sacred Heart University in Fairfield and Real Artways in Hartford. He's been the recipient of the 2024 Lillian Oralski and William Freed grant in Provincetown, and then most recently just was awarded a Creative Capital grant, which is a really prestigious, really amazing award, and congratulations again for that. But yeah, just help us welcome Jeff.
Yeah, well, thank you all for being here, and a huge thank you to Low Season Artist Projects and the Block Island Arts Council, and to Magdalene Livesey for hosting us this last week and next week. I'm really happy to be here to talk to you all today a little bit about my art practice. So I make art about the intertwined histories of pharmaceuticals and color. My hypersynthetic paintings, sculptures, drawings, and videos are infused with actual pharmaceuticals and chemicals. I appropriate imagery from art history and advertising to create abstracted, pointless, color-saturated works that explore the ecstasy and toxicity of our present moment. So mostly I work in all those different media. I think today mostly I'm going to focus on painting, which has kind of been the bulk of what I've focused on in my practice over the last 5 years or so. And this is kind of a good example of that. And I'll talk a little bit more about the process, but sort of working with images from pharmaceutical commercials and transforming them into these kind of pointillist paintings in which I'm mixing actual ground-up pharmaceuticals in with the paint. But I wanted to sort of jump way back into the past and talk a little bit about how I sort of came to this. When I was in art school, this was almost 20 years ago now, I received a gift of a clock, actually from my now mother-in-law, who at the time was a psychiatric nurse practitioner. And back at that point, pharmaceutical companies would go around to offices, and they would, in trying to promote their products, they would offer all this kind of swag. They would take doctors and nurses out to lunch, and they would also bring all these kind of pens and mugs and kind of office supplies, including these kind of clocks. And so my mother-in-law gave me this clock, I think kind of as a joke gift, and I hung it in the wall of my studio in art school, and more people paid attention to the clock than my art, right? So I knew that there was something kind of interesting there that was happening. So I took the clock and I put it into a sculpture. It wasn't exactly, this is maybe a second or third version. I don't have any photographs of the first one I did, but it was sort of an otherwise kind of like generic abstract sculpture. I was early in my art school days, and I hung the clock on it. And in the critique, it sort of went really kind of bonkers. Like people had really, really strong reactions. Some students thought it was really sort of a provocative critique of the pharmaceutical system. Other people thought that it wasn't critical enough, and that by putting this clock in there, I was sort of supporting Big Pharma. One student, it wasn't this clock, it was the Zoloft clock. One of the students confessed that they were on Zoloft and started talking about their own battles with depression, and how it had saved their life. And so sort of by the time I left the critique, it was a really kind of stunning kind of experience. I was sort of trying to get my head around, like everyone had a really strong reaction to this and a really different reaction to this. So I kept making this kind of work. And sort of experimenting with these kind of different, kind of materials, and sort of thinking a little bit more about the kind of pharmaceutical realm. And it was a very sort of research-heavy program, so they sort of encouraged me to do some different research. And in that process, I sort of made this interesting discovery about the origin of the word pharmaceutical, which is this Greek word pharmakon. And it meant simultaneously, it could mean all at the same time, cure, poison, and paint. Sometimes paint could be translated as like a color or even like makeup, but the idea of some kind of supplement that would be applied to the human body or consumed by the human body. So it was really intriguing that it was this kind of sort of substance that people would make and then consume in some way, and it could help you, it could hurt you, or it could be used for sort of aesthetic purposes, right? It was also super interesting that it was the origin word of part of the origin of our word toxic. The toxicon pharmakon is a poison-tipped arrow that was used for hunting, right? And so toxic has this kind of, now, especially the last decade or so, this kind of double meaning, both in terms of sort of chemical toxicity, but also kind of behavioral or cultural toxicity, which is really interesting. And the more I kind of began to think about this and kind of research about it, I realized that both drugs and paint really sort of share a kind of common sort of origin story and production history. In that sort of in pre-industrial times, they would be kind of made in the same way, right? You would gather some kind of organic material, plants or berries or shells or insects, and you would kind of concentrate them, dry them out, go through some kind of process of altering them, and then you would grind them up and you would mix them with a kind of binder. So in the case of paint, it might be oils or egg or fat, and in the case of drugs, it could be something similar like an oil or a fat that you would apply to the skin, or something almost like a clay or something that you could actually like swallow, right? Something that would make it more like a very kind of early version of a pill. So I was kind of really interested that there was this kind of through line and this kind of connection between the two. And so I kept working with it. I sort of kept sort of playing with these ideas. I was really sort of fascinated by the clock as this kind of symbol of sort of time management and the way that drugs are kind of a form of bodily management. So this was kind of another piece that I made. It was a much larger piece. I made this kind of sort of movable clock tower. And there was sort of a clock on each position, and it was sort of made up out of scraps of wood. You see over here there's kind of one painting that's sort of a very early version of me sort of beginning to try to paint with sort of pharmaceuticals. In this case, it was just painting directly with things like Pepto-Bismol and cough syrup, ground up multivitamins that I'd mixed with resin and just kind of splattered in this very kind of, sort of expressionistic way. In school, I didn't really study painting. I focused more on sculpture and video. So I was always sort of intimidated by the painters. Excuse me. I was always sort of intimidated by painters, so I sort of avoided it for the most of the time when I was in grad school. But I was still really intrigued by the pharmaceutical elements. I began to make these videos where I would take the advertisements from television and I would cut them up and rearrange them into different configurations. And I explored sort of working with all these kind of found objects from different kind of pharmaceutical swag kind of giveaways. And so I left school and I continued to work mostly in sculpture and video. And I'm really going to just sort of jump ahead pretty quickly here towards the present. But I did continue to always sort of try to make paintings that never kind of quite worked for me, although I think there's some interesting things in them at this point. This was one where I sort of was playing with iodine, which makes a sort of beautiful staining kind of color. And so I was kind of experimenting with painting with that, kind of over a spray paint base. This was the first version in which I sort of ground up the pharmaceuticals and mixed it in with the paint. And I really thought about that as sort of going back to that kind of pre-industrial version and kind of inverting it, right? Instead of grinding up something to make the paint, I was sort of grinding up the finished drug molecule to mix in with the paint that already existed. But it still kind of referenced that process. So in this case, it's a monochrome, so just one color here. I used the kind of blue that kind of was about the same color as the Zoloft logo. And so I ground up some Zoloft pills and mixed it in with the paint, and I painted it on this burlap sack. The timing was during the recession of 2008, 2009, and there was this kind of curious sort of repetition of this story in media and on podcasts about how it was like the Great Depression was so bad that people were wearing burlap clothes, and I heard this again and again, sort of cited as like, we were headed in that direction, and I was like, this is really weird that this is kind of this trope that keeps getting mentioned. So I sort of made a very kind of literal kind of piece playing with the idea of sort of a burlap sack as clothing, just kind of referencing that economic period. Jumping ahead, I continued to kind of try to experiment with this, working again sort of in a completely sort of non-representational form, and sort of experimenting with grinding up different pharmaceuticals or taking different other kinds of chemicals and mixing them in this case with oil paint, right? And I would sort of do these things where I would these were very process-based. I would paint onto like sheets of plastic and then apply the canvas onto it and kind of rub the canvas onto it to transfer the paint. Sometimes I would let the plastic sit on it and it would dry and kind of make these kind of crinkling patterns like the piece you see on the right side. So I was kind of, really, again, sort of really devoted to this idea of kind of playing with these kind of pharmaceutical elements as a kind of material, and still kind of figuring out kind of the best way to kind of put these things all together. In 2018, I had this really unique opportunity that really kind of changed things for me. I had the opportunity to do an installation at Yale University's West Campus, which was a former Bayer pharmaceutical facility. It was a production facility and offices, and so there was a building there. At the time, they would have this sort of annual arts festival where artists could, take over kind of an abandoned building and do different installations. And that year it was at this building at the campus there, and it had basically been untouched since Bayer was there. So they let me sort of roam the building, and I gathered all these kind of materials, photographs and posters and pieces of office furniture that had Bayer logos on it. And I was also really kind of dedicated to this idea of a kind of site-specific research-based practice. So I began to research the history of Bayer, and I made this really fascinating discovery, which was that Bayer was invented in kind of the mid to late 1800s. And they actually began not as a pharmaceutical company, but as a company that made pigments and dyes and colors, right? So in that period of the late 19th century, what was happening is synthetic chemistry was kind of being sort of popularized as kind of a scientific method. There was a sort of excess of, this isn't quite a good picture of it, but like coal tar, kind of remnants from coal production. And with that, chemists could extract, this incredible rainbow of colors that had never really been found before, right? Sort of through millions of years of biological matter that had been compacted, they were able to extract all these kind of amazing colors, but that also could, be found, some of them could be found to have medicinal purposes, right? So Bayer was one of a number of companies. These are just a few that still exist, but there were many companies like this. They were basically making simultaneously drugs and paint, right? So this sort of pre-industrial process of gathering organic materials was now shifting to like a synthetic process where both drugs and paint were being manufactured in the same way by the same companies, in this kind of much more sort of consistent way. And at least I always had this vision of the late 19th century as kind of a gray and dreary place in Europe, and certainly the cities were polluted, right? There's no doubt about that. But I think it's partly because we see all these kind of, black and white photographs, even like a lot of period piece movies, they tend to be like fairly colorless. The painting on the right by Gustav Caillebotte, there's not always a lot of color. But again, the more that I read about it, the more that I realized that with all these new colors, it was actually an incredibly colorful place in the cities in Europe at this time, right? So the color mauve, and then this color on the right, which is a kind of fuchsia color, that was a color that was invented by Bayer called fuchsin, or a kind of version of fuchsia. And the one on the right is actually still used today in microscope slide staining. So there was all these colors being developed for all kinds of fabrics, for clothing, for drapery. And I think it was more, there was a lot of places it was a lot more colorful like this, right? Where fake flowers were really in vogue at the time. Basically flowers that were made out of cloth that had been dyed these super bright colors, right? And so these colors were basically inexpensive and readily available, and they became really popular quite quickly. So I just became really kind of interested as I sort of began to think about this. And then I was thinking, so all this is happening at the same time as Impressionism, right, and Post-Impressionism, these kind of early modernist painting movements. And I began to think about, what I'm not saying that the Impressionists or the Post-Impressionists were sort of explicitly responding to this, right? They weren't making paintings with smaller brushstrokes and more visible brushstrokes because things were, chemical histories were changing, or because there was, more paint in tubes, or because, drugs, synthetic drugs were more readily available. I'm not saying that they were using these drugs or using the paints. A lot of them were skeptical of a lot of these new colors, and rightly so, because many of them weren't color fast, right? And they wouldn't last. But I like to think that in some way they were sort of, subconsciously responding to kind of the atomization that was happening, sort of culturally, right, and chemically and sort of scientifically at the time. And so someone like Seurat, who's known for his pointillist works with these kind of very kind of tiny brushstrokes that build up the image, are really kind of driven by a kind of interest in this kind of atomization and kind of breaking down of of scenes into tiny little bits, right? And so, and Seurat was really interested in the science behind this. He was very interested in the kind of he worked with this kind of chemist, Michel Chevreul, who was really responding and working with these new colors and dyes. There were so many colors, then people would put them together and they would make muddy colors, or they would just not look very bright. And Chevreul was sort of figuring out about sort of complementary color schemes, and all kinds of different things that were going on. And so he was kind of really kind of tied into that, and Seurat was really kind of thinking about this in a scientific way, and so he was clearly like aware of these kind of chemical things happening at the time. So I took all this kind of research that I had done, and I put it into this really big installation that I did at the campus here. And here's an image of that, and you can see it's sort of all kinds of different things happening at the same time. There's these kind of found kind of posters and photographs that I'd found in the building, some of which I would paint on. I've included some of the clocks, and I made this very sort of Bayer specific. So all the drugs that I used and all of the kind of things that I were using were pharmaceuticals or sort of chemicals that were produced by Bayer, right? And so, I was sort of mixing specific colors with specific drugs from Bayer and applying them. The kind of expanding foam on the top of the bookshelf here, that was invented by Bayer. And so, and these are pieces of office furniture that I gathered in the space. I made a variety of sort of different video pieces using Bayer commercials and promotional materials. And so it was a really great opportunity to kind of just fill up the space and kind of just sort of really be kind of maximalist about it and just try a lot of different things, both to kind of reference the site specifically, but also the history of Bayer. And then it was the first time that I sort of started to make my own dots, right? I started to make my own pointillist marks in there. And it was this idea again of these like sort of list of materials, and I was mixing, grinding up one of them, mixing it in with a certain color of paint, and then I was using, whatever the packaging was from that drug to make the dots, right? So these very visible green dots on here were from Claritin, which is an allergy drug, and I was just making the dots using the kind of those like blister packs that they come in, the kind of foil packs you have to pop the pills out of, and I was using those to make the dots, right? And it was a very kind of early version of that where I was sort of just trying to figure this out and how to make this, right? And it was really, in some ways it's really this kind of direct response and really coming very much from Seurat, who the more that I sort of learned about just seemed so incredibly experimental, but and then just really kind of tying into kind of the imagery of Impressionism as well, right? Because I also began to look at, I was looking at all this Impressionist painting, and it was funny because for so long, especially as a contemporary artist, I dismissed the Impressionists. I would say, okay, this stuff is, this is the stuff that's on posters and mugs. It's those super palatable stuff that you can take your whole family to see, and everyone will like it, and they're beautiful. But the more I sort of spent time with them, the more radical they seemed to really kind of feel to me, and to really realize what a sort of momentous break was happening in painting at the time. So I just started looking at all these images, and the more that I looked at them, the more that I realized that there was all these kind of visual through lines between Impressionist paintings and contemporary pharmaceutical ads, right? So there's just all these themes. So the themes that the Impressionists were portraying, right, of sort of at that point middle upper class leisure, of the kind of the bourgeois class of late 19th century Europe. It's sort of people in very controlled spaces, parks and fields. They were sort of traveling out to the suburbs and going out to these sort of more rural areas to paint for the day. So you have these themes of kind of sort of well-dressed people, women holding umbrellas, families picnicking. If they're in a kind of urban environment, in many cases it was not kind of portrayed as particularly dirty or anything like that. It was very kind of clean and controlled. And then I sort of realized that that's very much the case for these pharmaceutical ads, which are portraying sort of our ideals of health are in a similar way, right? That when they're sort of promoting these products to be healthy or to make us desire this kind of healthiness, they're using similar images. There's a striking number of images of people holding umbrellas. People are picnicking. People are in parks. When people are in cities, they're not the dirty party cities. They're always very clean. When they're out in nature, it's not wild, dangerous nature. It's always very controlled and very, very bucolic and picturesque, right? So I was really intrigued by these kind of similarities, and I don't think this is in any way conscious, but I think it's fascinating that there's been this kind of through line, right? These images from the Impressionists, those were some of the first kinds of those images being produced, and yet they still really kind of have meaning for us at this point. So I then sort of very kind of literally kind of put all these things together, right? And starting off by kind of working from existing compositions from sort of art historical works. So this is a piece, Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe, is a piece. There's a version of it that's much better known by Manet, right? But I was actually really drawn to this piece by Claude Monet, which is in the upper right, and it's an interesting piece. I think compositionally it's really interesting, and it's really kind of gorgeous painting. It was also, I just found it kind of intriguing that it's been damaged throughout history. So the upper right and the lower right sections have actually been lost. They were sort of at some point cut away and discarded. So the canvas is now in two sections. And so I combined those together, and I kind of built an image around it. And what I did is I just took the existing composition, and it was surprisingly not that hard to go and find images from contemporary ads in the same poses or similar poses to the figures in the original, right? So on the far left, there's this kind of male figure sort of standing and kind of looking across the canvas. In the center and on the right side, there's two seated figures, a seated man and a seated woman. This woman standing here kind of facing backwards, right, and facing away from the viewer. So I sort of replaced these, in all the same poses in the same spots with contemporary figures, and then I began to kind of create my own kind of version of this kind of pointillism. And again, where I basically created this system where I sort of matched a certain drug with a certain color. Usually it had something to do with the logo or the branding of that color. And then I would grind up that material or mix it in with that paint and apply it using making these dots, right? And so I would build up the image using these dots. I also sort of realized that I could have much better control of the dots instead of using the blister packs, as I could make my own stamps. Using a CNC router, or basically a router where I can create a computer file and it will cut out the design for me. And I could basically create any kind of set of pills that I wanted, right? Any kind of combination of shapes and any kind of arrangement, and it just gave me the whole range of possibilities, right? And this became just really empowering for me to be able to basically make these paintings without really using a paintbrush for the most part, just using these kind of stamps, right? So they're actually kind of really like stamps that I'm using to make the paintings. This was another example of kind of a similar process, taking an old work, that Caillebotte painting from earlier, updating the figures from contemporary ads. In this case, I also updated the building in the upper left side from the sort of classic Parisian building on the upper left to that's the former Purdue Pharma headquarters in Stamford, Connecticut. So kind of, making a pretty explicit reference in this case to, the opioid epidemic and sort of some of the issues of that. You also see on this one that I sort of limited the color palette to red and blue. That's referencing this phrase red pilling and blue pilling, which emerged from this movie The Matrix, but has really kind of taken on a life of its own, especially in kind of internet culture. And now it's at this point where kind of any color or any object can be pilled, right? If you add pilled to something, it sort of means this kind of transformative, perhaps obsessive relationship with it. So it was interesting for me to limit the color palettes to shades and tints of red and blue, and then set them off against a yellow background to kind of create this primary color triad. But then it adds this kind of, potentially a little bit sinister meaning in terms of the way that red pilling and blue pilling is used often in our culture. Here's a detail of that where you can see a little bit closer how I'm sort of making the marks and how they look kind of really close up on the canvas. Right? And sometimes I'm using the colors in different ways, in very intentional ways, so that, the face of this woman here is made with pink from a birth control pill, and the male face here is blue from Viagra, right? And so sometimes I'm using colors in a very specific way and using drugs in a very specific way, focusing on, say, issues of gender or class or race. Other times it's just about using the color that I want. I want a certain blue, and I don't really care what the particular drug is that's associated with it. So what I basically would start to do then was to take images from pharmaceutical ads that existed. I would bring them into a program and turn them into basically a giant kind of stencil that then I could use and then transform into the painting, right? So in most cases at this point, I'm working from an existing pharmaceutical ad. I'm not necessarily changing it all that much, other than maybe making some small adjustments to it. And then I use that as the template. And, I sort of plan out things to some degree, but there's also a lot of improvisation where I'm not trying to make these photorealistic in any way. I'm trying to kind of also play with lots of elements of abstraction and kind of making things that don't necessarily make sense, whether it's the color of the skin or the color of the background. Sometimes I want the sky to be blue, and sometimes I want it to be some kind of a surreal, strange color. Here's one where it's sort of a little bit more the latter, right? So sometimes it can be a pretty kind of controlled, kind of consistent kind of image, and other times I really want it to get kind of out of control and be really sort of approach something almost psychedelic. This is a piece that's not taken from pharmaceutical ads per se, but from marketing materials for luxury ayahuasca retreats. For those of you who don't know, ayahuasca is a kind of hallucinogen that has been around in sort of South and Central America for in different cultures for many, many years. And it's been discovered that it has potential really powerful properties of healing and sort of helping people with trauma, right? And so it becomes a really interesting thing in which now it's become almost like a sort of a tourist destination for people. The actual process of consuming ayahuasca is apparently very kind of messy and sort of visceral. You get physically sick during it, but then hopefully there's some kind of elements of kind of mental clarity that emerge from it. But people will go down there, and you don't do that the whole time, but in between these kind of sort of very powerful sessions, you do yoga and stand-up paddleboarding and go to the beach and explore the rainforest, right? So it's this really interesting thing where there's a kind of colonialism that's happening, a kind of sort of cultural tourism, and yet this is a product this is a chemical that has real potential, and it won't be surprising if within 50 years it's a pharmaceutical that is utilized and prescribed within the United States, right? So there's a kind of a pathway here that's both maybe problematic but also potentially important and helpful. Here's again kind of another detail, and in this I was really kind of intentionally dialing up the complementary color contrasts and kind of really trying to make something that's really overloaded and almost too much to look at when you're looking at it in person. I also work with completely non-representational imagery, so things that are completely abstract. And a lot of these are a little bit more intuitive. Sometimes there's a striking number of also sort of abstract paintings in pharmaceutical ads kind of in the background. So sometimes I use those as a kind of a compositional starting point. This one's a little bit different. You wouldn't necessarily know from looking at it, but I've kind of grouped these pharmaceuticals to be roughly kind of figurative. So the ones at the top are pharmaceuticals that mostly you would use to treat conditions involving the head or the brain, in the middle for the torso and reproductive organs, and the bottom for the legs, right? The lower half or the lower third for the legs. So I've kind of created this very kind of very roughly figurative piece, but not intended to look particularly figurative. And one of the things I really like about these kind of completely abstract pieces is that they, with a lot of the other ones, you don't necessarily see, you can tell they're made with stamps, but you don't see the full stamp, right? There's borders on there because I'm masking out different parts and kind of isolating certain parts. But here you kind of see these really specific patterns that are being produced, right? This kind of wavy grid that I created here, or these pink pills that go around the order, which again is a sort of a packaging from a birth control pill, and sort of then it really references that kind of time marking that pills kind of produce, right? When you're taking pills on a cycle, whether it's daily or twice a daily, or you're setting something to remind yourself that there's a kind of mark making, a time making that sort of happens through pill consumption, and that becomes just sort of really visible in these ones where the whole stamp is visible. So I've also really enjoyed these. I think sometimes people sort of have interpreted these as like being inside of a molecule or being inside of your brain on a molecule, right? That it's a different kind of space that I'm thinking about than the kind of more representational images, right? I also make tons of these kind of smaller pieces on paper, which are kind of almost like test pieces, or like I'll use them when I'm kind of finishing with a stamp to kind of clean off the stamp. But they allow me to kind of make all these kind of very kind of specific kind of color tests and combinations that I can then look at and think about later how I might apply that to a larger painting. But I like to do these on, again, these kind of, the promotional note paper, or on actual magazine advertisements themselves that I collect. I've worked with some really large scale. This is kind of the largest scale piece I've done to date. It's 8 by 12 feet. And, again, sort of taken pretty directly from a really striking Zoloft advertisement, in which there's kind of all these figures kind of standing and doing their own thing, not engaging with each other, and these kind of weird washes of color in the background. It was such an incredible advertisement. I sort of knew I had to kind of work with it. And working with something this large, it just really kind of envelops the viewer, and it creates a really different sensation. So I've worked really large, and then I've also worked much smaller. This is just 10 by 9 inches, right? And one of the things that's kind of fun is because I'm using these stamps and making these dots, the dots are always the same no matter the size of the canvas, right? So when it's small, the dots suddenly have this much bigger presence. And when it's big, there's so many of them that they become almost lost at a certain point. So it's been a really interesting kind of parameter to work with, working with this specific size, because it really shifts depending on the size of the piece. And so I've continued to kind of work in this realm. I'm still really interested in this kind of idea of kind of sort of red pilling and blue pilling, and these kind of different kind of color combinations. This is an ad for sort of a kind of like a anti-anxiety medication from a German pharmaceutical that was really striking because it had this kind of image of this figure standing in front of basically like a window, but the window also sort of looked a lot like a painting, right? So it becomes kind of a figure, perhaps looking at a painting, standing in front of a painting, right? And I've begun to experiment with different kinds of borders, sort of in the same way that Seurat did in his paintings. He would create these kind of dotted borders that were separate from the piece itself, that were, that were really kind of really striking in terms of what they were kind of doing, and really unique at the time. I've also at points sort of tried to take the work in directions that are somewhat kind of political, or at least sort of drawing attention to the political situation of things. I get sort of asked a lot, like, what's my position on pharmaceuticals, right? Am I for them or against them? And I've been pushed a lot over my career to sort of pick a side, right? And I've always sort of refused, in part because just literally I don't think there really can be a side, because and it's sort of built into that origin term pharmacon, right? That drugs are simultaneously helpful and harmful, right? And so there's no question that there can be incredibly problematic situations. The opioid epidemic and Purdue Pharma did incredibly bad things, right? But some of these companies, Pfizer, which we could certainly criticize for over-marketing products like Viagra, also produce one of the COVID vaccines that saved millions of lives, right? And so, for any drug, for any one drug or any one drug company, there can be there can be good things about it, and there can be things that maybe aren't so good. So I've always felt like it's really kind of important to kind of like keep the work not exactly neutral, but to encompass both of those aspects, right? So that to me, there's always kind of an element of a little bit of hopefully beauty with the works, but also maybe something that's a little like an undercurrent of something that's a little bit sinister or a little bit kind of uncanny, right? That makes you think that something's off, because I think that's kind of built into this process. But this is a piece, where thinking about sort of some of the issues with reproductive politics at this point, right, and the way in which abortion is being legislated, and then that has sort of come out through the abortion pill, right? And really, no matter where anyone falls on the kind of spectrum of that, it's sort of hard to ignore the fact that, like, the idea of the medical abortion pills is really kind of important, right, in terms of both it being something that people are using or that people are using to sort of circumvent legal restrictions in certain states. It has a kind of both a kind of level of empowerment, but also kind of a level of kind of political sort of agency that's kind of important to it at this point. So this is a piece. This is one of the first pieces I've done where I've actually generated the image using AI. So I plugged a lot of pharmaceutical ads into an AI program, and then plugged in this prompt, which was basically taken from an article, kind of sort of talking about kind of alternative processes or potentials for a future if abortion and the pill were completely outlawed in this country. And it generated this image which, on the surface might sort of look kind of normal and kind of like, again, sort of approaching an impressionist painting. But then you notice kind of some of the objects that are on their picnic blanket, which are these kind of chemical objects and a model of the female reproductive system. It's crossed out here because the AI would not generate anything with that terminology in there, so I had to remove that terminology from it in order to get an image. But then you also see that the woman on the right side is wearing this kind of dress or a cloak that then actually turns into the picnic blanket that they're laying on. And that her dress and that whole blanket is made up of the two pills that make up the abortion pill, mifepristone and misoprostol. And the colors that I've assigned them that match their packaging. So in this case, being sort of very intentional about some of the stakes of what I'm kind of working with. I've had some really unique opportunities to do installations and show the work in different contexts, which have been really sort of meaningful. This is one from a couple years ago in which the work was installed in a historic house from like the early 1900s. Which I really liked because it was almost like, well, maybe this is like, if the house happened to have been art collectors, maybe they would have had actual impressionist paintings when they were contemporary on the wall, right? So I was like, oh, this is really interesting. And then I created this wallpaper of printed dots and then covered the walls with that. So this idea of the dots just kind of completely enveloping the viewer. You'll see that I'm still working with the clocks. The clocks are still sort of something I utilize and will sort of pull out in different installations at different points. But I'm definitely sort of really interested in not just making the paintings, but kind of expanding out and utilizing the whole space in different ways. It's been nice to have some opportunities to show them in really large scale spaces, especially with some of the larger pieces. You can get a little bit better sense of the scale here. So kind of post-industrial kind of spaces or really large galleries are really kind of amazing to install some of these works in. Just this last fall, I was able to do a couple of really interesting things at this show. The first was just paint the wall a color, right? Instead of maybe a non-traditional color for a gallery space. Usually white is standard for a gallery kind of setting, but sometimes like lighter pastel kind of colors. But using this super bright blue against the kind of, in this case, a lot of yellows and oranges created this really nice vibration that I was really interested in engaging with. And then also in that show, I was able to do, for the first time, a kind of wall installation where I sort of painted dots actually on the wall, in this case to look like they're sort of emanating out of the painting, right? So I painted this border around the painting. That's, again, very sort of Seurat-like, that it's separate from the actual image, and then I kind of created it so that the dots are emerging off of the edges all around the canvas on the wall. And this was interesting because normally the paint is thin to a point where it's almost like a liquid because I'm working flat, right? I'm doing these stamps, and I want them to kind of pool and dry in just the right way, and so it's a very kind of loose paint. And this I had to play with the viscosity, and it was a really kind of a challenge to make marks vertically, right? So it was a kind of a different kind of process, but it was really kind of fascinating and really kind of gratifying to work with and see just how different it felt to have this kind of painting kind of really sort of exploding and kind of emanating off of the wall. And so this is kind of a little bit of the direction that I'm headed in at this point, which is to kind of is kind of combining some of the different elements that I've been working on. Mostly thus far, like I'd been working, with these kind of separate representational and non-representational or abstract paintings, right? And I've been thinking more about kind of combining those two together into one image, but also much more literally disintegrating the figures, right? And sort of having the figures disintegrating into the background and the background disintegrating into the foreground. And that in itself isn't necessarily radical. There's lots of painters that play with a figure-ground kind of relationship, right? But I'm really interested in this idea of making this in some ways very literal, right? That pharmaceuticals have these chemical properties, and part of that is that we distribute them into the landscape, right, into the environment, right? They leave our bodies, they go into the water supply, and so there's places like, Seattle apparently has the highest concentrations of antidepressants in the water system because of what's excreted and then goes back into it, right? And then we consume sort of minute traces of these things again. So the environment comes back into us, right? So it sort of works both ways, where the figure is disintegrating into the landscape is disintegrating into the figure. And so that's something I've been really sort of trying to kind of play with and kind of push on, both sort of kind of metaphorically, but then really quite literally in the canvas itself. So this is a piece from earlier last year in which I was sort of really kind of doing just that, and kind of having the figures break apart and having elements of the background move into the figure. Over the last summer, I was sort of working on this series of kind of just studies that I was looking at, where I was really just testing out how to do this, right? How am I going to get to this point? What's too much, where it's no longer recognizable? What's not enough? What are different ways that I can combine these things? So I just took this one single image and repeated it, basically again and again and again, sort of experimenting with different ways to kind of do just that, sort of, basically have the figure and the background kind of, disintegrating into each other, or kind of, atomizing and reatomizing into each other. Here's a couple of close-ups from that. So this one on the left is a little bit more like what I was thinking about in terms of combining elements of the abstract and the figurative. So like these kind of big purple blotches, that's a little bit more how I would make the kind of sort of non-representational pieces, and just alternating layers of that, right? Alternating layers of something that's recognizable and not, to sort of push it to a point where it's not quite as identifiable, and yet the figure is still dissolving. And the one on the right plays with visibility in a different way, where it's just focusing on a limited palette, right? And so that brings me back to this idea of the kind of color pilling. So in this case, red pilling. But there's, literally these terms exist for almost every kind of color. There's such a thing as pink pilling, green pilling, gold pilling, black pilling, right? And so there's all these ways in which I can potentially utilize these things with a very kind of limited color palette that raises interesting sort of issues of the visibility and invisibility within the work. And then here's sort of another more recent piece where I'm sort of, again, kind of testing that out, sort of trying to play with this dissolving of the figure more, utilizing certain kind of color combinations, using certain kinds of complementary color arrangements next to each other, but focusing on, again, kind of making the image a little bit harder to read and a little bit more this idea of the kind of molecules changing place between the positions of things. And then this is what sort of Joe was mentioning in the introduction. This was the kind of grant that I received that was just announced yesterday. It's for this project that will probably take 2 to 3 years to realize, but it's a project in which I'm going to kind of go back to that that sort of the idea of that bare pharmaceutical installation from years ago, where I worked with painting, sculpture, and video all in one space. And in this case, finding an abandoned pharmacy. There's many where I live in New Haven, so that might be a starting point. But the ideal is to probably do it in New York City, because just in terms of foot traffic and getting visitors in there. But I'm going to take the sort of, as the internet has sort of become more of a sort of a dominant force in terms of commerce, there's a lot of pharmacies that are closing, right? People can actually get most of their prescriptions online. A lot of brick and mortar stores are closing. So to take over kind of an abandoned pharmacy, and I'll do kind of a similar installation where I combine all these different elements. At the moment, I'm thinking of kind of grouping it sort of by these different colors, right? So there's kind of a red pilling and a blue pilling and a green pilling section with the kind of things that are associated with that, right? That blue pilling tends to be pills for depression or for masculine products, and red pilling tends to be sort of things that have to do with the heart or blood and things like that, but then also has these kind of other added resonances with internet culture. So I have several other things that I'll be working on, and I'll be kind of just working on the paintings as well, but this is kind of the next step, is sort of doing a really kind of big kind of installation that puts all these things together in kind of a really interesting way. So thank you all for listening. I'm happy to take any questions if anyone has any questions. Yeah.
A simple one. Is it important to you to convey next to a painting at a show what materials were used or what your message is, or is it enough for people to just appreciate the results?
It's a great question. I think the work, it works in both ways. I think it works on its own without knowing really anything about it. I think the more you know about it, the more it sort of adds to the work. So I think the work sort of stands on its own without seeing any kind of information about it. But whenever I show the work, I request that the checklist or the label has the full list of information. In some cases, the checklist is separate, so the person has to seek it out and look at that information. In other situations, if there's a label, you're likely to encounter it pretty directly. I really like for people to know that information. One of the things that's been interesting is that I think of these pharmaceuticals as universal in the sense that everyone has some sort of relationship to them. And so when it's a different relationship for every person, right? And so whenever people see that list of the materials, they often talk to me about their own experiences. They say, I'm on that drug, or my parent is on this drug, or I had a really bad experience with this drug. So it's like putting that list in there somehow makes it makes people think about their own experiences in an interesting way. So I really like for it to be in there in that way.
So I have a couple of questions now. That made me think of, well, are the side effects also listed? That could be like another text element, right?
Right.
Like another palimpsest. Now, where are you getting these drugs? Like, are people just giving you their and are you not worried about like any potential toxic effects, or like I can't imagine like Pepto-Bismol or something being easy to work with to paint. So like that is his own art, like making it into something that you can like put in a painting that will last, right?
Right.
That won't like just get yucky.
Yeah, no, so all great questions. So the question of where I get the drugs, it's mostly kind of like a crowdsource process at this point. People cleaning out their medicine cabinets.
Yeah, we didn't know that.
I know. I guess I should announce that in advance, and can be a drug drop off there, right? It's kind of amazing because enough people know that I do this that people will basically clean out their medicine cabinets, and most of us have expired medications or things like that that people will pass on to me. I have done some purchasing of things like on the internet from India or Mexico or other countries, so not necessarily entirely legal, but it's it's been a combination of kind of people gifting me things, which to me is like, it's very special because it's like these drugs are sort of incredibly intimate part of all of our lives, right? And so for somebody to trust that, I would never reveal that. The labels are immediately destroyed as soon as I get them. But it's a kind of like a form of portraiture that I think about. That none of these are portraits or self-portraits in any way, but there's a kind of an indirect kind of form of portraiture that happens with these by using drugs that people have used. Regarding the kind of stability of these, for the most part, what I'm doing is I'm mixing the ground up drugs into acrylic paint, and so the acrylic paint is fundamentally plastic, so it should be pretty stable. Painting with things like Pepto-Bismol or different matter, I don't really use that too much anymore, but I definitely have friends who are conservators at museums, and they've used the word nightmare with these works because there's no guarantee, right? I mean, they've been fine for a few years, but 20, 100 years from now, they could be falling apart. You know, who knows? For the most part, the drugs don't affect the consistency of the paint. Occasionally, some of them do, and they'll actually start to clump the paint or separate the paint. So they're, even though these are unrelated things, they do have chemical connections. So.
Just one last thing. Did the surface you chose to use make a difference? And how do you think it'll extend the life?
Like the material they use?
Whether it was canvas or
canvas or... So mostly I use this polyester canvas, and I've done that for a couple of reasons, but probably the biggest one is that I like that it's I like this idea that they're really like sort of hyper-synthetic, right? So the paint is synthetic, the drugs are synthetic. Then I'm using canvases made out of polyester, and I actually make my own stretcher bars out of PVC. So the whole thing, it's horribly unenvironmental, of course, but it's intentionally really synthetic, right? So it's I think interestingly it will last longer because of that. I used to work on regular canvas, and there's no question that some of these chemicals would degrade that canvas or promote like mildew growth because they're meant to break down and they're meant to degrade. So it has a kind of double usefulness in terms of like a kind of conceptual meaning, but then also it practically these have lasted really well so far. But that's a great question.
So you mix the drugs into the paint.
Mm-hmm.
Do they affect the color, or is it just really symbolic that the drugs in the paint? I mean, you have the list, but if you mix it with your blues, and I'm not a painter, but does it actually change the color? So if you put Zoloft into blue, does it become a different kind of blue?
It becomes happy.
Yeah, no, it becomes happy. It's a great question. It doesn't change the color, mostly because I think there's probably a couple of reasons. A long time ago I tried to paint just using the pills and extracting the colors from the pills. Those colors were they were a very limited palette, and they're also designed to not be color fast because they're designed for our bodies to break them down. And they just weren't very bright or interesting. So I sort of decided that wouldn't work. By mixing them in now, it's usually a fairly small amount. So like in a painting like this is 20 by 16. It's maybe like a pill's worth or half a pill's worth for each drug that you see on there. So it's really not that much. I think if I mixed, say, a blue Zoloft pill into white paint, it would change the color. But because they're ultimately fairly close, I'm mixing it into a blue that's already pretty similar. It doesn't alter it, at least not that I can tell. But I think with certainly certain pills, that would at some point sort of alter the paint if they're different enough, for sure.
Since you use so many colors, and each color is so important, and there's so many of these dots, what do you do when you make a mistake? And you say, I don't like that color there.
Well, it kind of depends on... It's a good question. Depending on where I am in the process, sometimes I can just wipe it off and just...
Oh, yeah?
Like if it's an immediate mistake, I can just remove it, and it usually won't. Probably because of the polyester canvas and sort of like wiping liquid off of plastic. But if it's dried, then I can go over it. But there's absolutely probably for every 3 paintings I keep, there's one that I end up discarding or throwing away because it doesn't work. Something doesn't work about it, and the mistakes are too many that I can't correct it. If it's a small area, I can usually go over it. There's always a little bit of texture to them because of the way that it's not super thick, but and I can actually use a razor blade to remove some of it and then go back over it. to try to hide the dot. Or if it's an issue of color, I want the same shape, then it's easier. I can just sort of go back over it. And I have stamps that are just one dot, so sometimes I can go in and fix an area with just one dot at a time, kind of very carefully.
It actually reminds me more of the Roman mosaics
Yeah.
than it does of Impressionism or Pointillism.
Yeah, no, certainly there's definitely a lot of other things that are kind of references that I'm interested in, like the mosaics for sure, Aboriginal painting from Australia. There's a lot of fabric painting from Africa that has a kind of resonance with what I do. I mean, the dot is a really interesting kind of pattern in itself, or an interesting object in itself, that it's been used in so many different ways throughout different parts of the world. So.
They're beautiful, by the way.
Thanks. Thank you.
And the brightness kind of, I don't know why, like, it makes me think like pop art as well, just like a cool, really.
Would go nice in the library
Yeah.
to have a mural.
Sure. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, well, I mean, Roy Lichtenstein is certainly the pop artist is certainly a reference that is a quick connection with the dots, right? And especially some of the ones where I'm using the primary colors, so that, yeah, no, I think there's definitely a kind of pop art element to them as well.
It was really interesting seeing your progression of experimentation and then more ideas
Yeah.
kind of presenting themselves, and you being able to apply different techniques to get even more deeper into the situation
Yeah.
and still make it look amazing.
Yeah. Thanks.
What kind of PPE are you using when you're handling these?
Oh yeah, that was your other question. Yeah, no. So when I usually, like, I sort of work by all mix the paint color that I want. I'll grind up the pills, and during that process, I'm wearing a respirator, gloves, and kind of like body protection. When I'm painting itself, I don't think there's much risk in terms of inhalation because it's already in the paint, but I'm always wearing gloves and trying to minimize contact. There's probably been a little bit of incidental sort of contact over the years. I haven't ever felt anything that I can be aware of. But yeah, I try to be pretty careful with these. I mean, some of them are really strong, and there's certain drugs that, like, conceptually I would love to include fentanyl in here, but I'm not going to touch that, right? So it's like, even in small amounts, it's
Because it's the ethics behind it. Or-
no, because it's so dangerous.
Oh, okay.
No, ethics. I mean, based on how I'm acquiring these, the ethics is already pretty gray for me, right?
But
So.
it seems to affect, like, the energy of the titles.
Sure,
Right?
sure.
So, like, I mean, right? Because you're working with all these things that, like, it must somehow, like, I know you're saying, like, you politically, you're kind of dipping your toe in or not, but right? Like.
Yeah, and a lot of the titles are just taken from the ads themselves,
Oh,
right? I
okay.
mean, this one is another one that's been generated by AI, but most of the other ones, the titles are just taken from the tagline of the ad. So I'm just giving back what the kind of image originally kind of sort of delivered to us in terms of the intention of the company. So.
And just an interesting, have any drug companies
Yeah, that
ever
was
asked
my
commissioned
question.
you?
Yeah.
No, it's a great question though. I have tried and failed to pitch myself as an artist in residence for drug companies.
Yeah.
I think I just haven't talked to the right person. I suspect that many of them might find that they think the work is critical of what they're doing. But the fact that I'm using a lot of their advertising materials, and ultimately, creating something that's hopefully kind of aesthetically pleasing is, would hopefully be of interest. I hope at some point to be at a, prominent enough that I could connect with them in some way. I'm hoping it won't be through a legal arrangement where they're trying to come after me for using their images. But yeah, I would love to connect. I mean, there's definitely pharmaceutical companies with large art collections. So if I can make that connection, it would be a great fit for sure.
We have an abandoned pharmacy if you need a little satellite.
Yeah, no, it's great.
Trying
Maybe.
to turn it into an art center for a long time, but maybe you could be the catalyst for that.
Yeah, maybe take it on the road. Right.
Oh, and I was thinking too, you mentioned in Seattle how there were a lot of antidepressants in the water. I spent a lot of time out there, and it is very gloomy.
Yes.
Right? Like the joke is, last winter it rained twice, once for 60 days, once for 90 days. Right? But my nephew, he works at Dartmouth in the sustainability environmental, and they did a study on a river, and they found that the fish, because there's so much much birth control in the water. The fish are now, what do they call it when they're both sexes? Like it's affected the, yeah, all the birth control in the water in the rivers.
Yeah, yeah, no, it definitely has a pretty profound effect on the environment. So, yeah,
They
well,
don't think about it, you
Yeah.
know?
It's, fish can naturally change gender, some fish can.
Yeah.
There's a word
well,
for that.
thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Um,